because government has plans to set up a holding company and even model it after Khazanah. What would your advice be? Maybe your top two, three advice be to policymakers?
It's important as you have a tremendous number of natural strengths. So look at the hand that you're dealt, look at the cards you have, and figure out where do you have strengths, where are there challenges, what do you want to be, what do you want to target over the long term. Lay out that map. And importantly, you have to be flexible because as you're trying to get from A to B, things always will be changing. And you can't have your head down necessarily and say we're going to B when B has moved. So be agile and be flexible. And then I think it's very important to make sure good governance is in place with solid private sector, domestic, and perhaps even international participation from people who are credible, respected, have a track record, so that you provide that outward-facing framework to parties. And then, as I said, there's a wonderful story here. So whether it's tourism, whether it's some of the various other state-owned enterprises, which perhaps have underperformed. And again, I'm not necessarily talking about, well, you become a profit-maximizing organization at the expense of inclusivity, sustainability, creating a wide gap between the 1% and the others in this country. It's not mutually exclusive.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this brand new series on Front Row here on Economy.lk. Today, we're here for a fascinating conversation with Kenneth Shen, who is the chairman of the EDOTCO Group, formerly of Khazanah in Malaysia as well. So we will hear a little bit about his story and the Khazanah story and what he's up to right now as well. Kenneth, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me today.
So Kenneth, you've had a very fascinating career in different parts of the world, focusing on sovereign wealth, global investing, nation building. How did you start this journey, and what got you here so far?
I guess most importantly for me, I have always tried not to go with the herd and to look and see interesting. If everyone is running one way, I'm the kind of person who will go back and look and see, well, gee, is there something really interesting that I can learn from and maybe be impactful? And that's how I've thought about my career. For example, when I joined Lehman Brothers in 1992, that was an organization that was very much in turmoil. The partnership had fallen apart. They had sold themselves to American Express. They had become Shearson Lehman. And I looked at that, and in those days, most of my classmates were going to Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, those types of firms. And I said, well, this is a very interesting firm. I can learn a lot, get responsibility. So I spent 4 years there. And then when I was looking to make a move, Salomon Brothers came knocking. And similarly, they were very much in disarray. It was they had gone through the U.S. government bond trading scandal. And I said, well, this is still a very good company. It could be an interesting place for someone reasonably new in their career. Going to Hong Kong, that was also an interesting opportunity. Part of it was also my wife.
Okay.
She had grown up in Asia, and she was looking, after spending many years in the U.S., in New York, going to school and living there, she was looking to move to Asia. So I raised my hand, and in a blink of an eye, we were there almost 10 years. But again, there were crises and there were a lot of opportunities.
Sure.
We moved there just after the handover of Hong Kong to China, which of course was an altogether a new time and somewhat uncertain for Hong Kong. And then 2 weeks after we moved there was the start of the Asian financial crisis.
Wow. Okay.
And so that was a great time for me to be there, to learn, take responsibility as much as I could. Similarly, after almost about 9 years in Hong Kong, the opportunity came to go to Qatar. And that was quite early. It was 2005 when Qatar, most people, was way before the QIA was formed and before people started viewing Qatar as an important source of capital. So I said, this could be an interesting opportunity. So I raised my hand and I went out. I didn't go with a long contract or all sorts of guarantees. I said, this is an interesting situation. Let
Mm.
me see how I can be helpful, learn, bring my experience, and make a solid contribution.
Yeah.
And it was a great personal and professional experience. And then similarly, after 5 years there, my wife and two kids were eager to come back to Asia. And again, similarly, Khazanah was not a first call type organization for many people.
Right.
But that opportunity came, and I said, well, this was great because for the first time in my professional career, it was an organization that was not solely focused on profit maximization. And first and foremost, for that organization, which is wonderful, the first consideration on any situation they look at is why is this relevant to Malaysia and the 30 million Malaysians? Yes, it needs to make commercial sense, but it's
Right.
not just about earning a return.
Yeah.
So that's sort of been my career, and I've been fortunate. There's a lot of good luck as well,
Yes.
but hard work, having head down, delivering, not getting involved in the office politics,
Yeah.
and trying to add value wherever I can.
So you mentioned Khazanah, and I think the time that you entered, some of the distress that was happening. For us in Sri Lanka, we look at the Khazanah model, we look at the Temasek model when we think of our own state-owned enterprise reform and where we want to get to. Can you talk about how the transformation happened from just being a domestically, looking at some of the state-owned enterprises, some of the social enterprises, to now becoming a very well-renowned kind of a sovereign wealth fund, as it were.
Okay, great question. Thank you, Sharon. I should start by saying a lot of this predates my
Yeah.
joining Khazanah, and so I can talk about some of the history as best as I can. So Khazanah was created in 1993, almost 30 years ago, and the initial mandate, if you will, was to be the central holding company for a lot of government-owned
Mhm.
enterprises. And you can imagine what those enterprises were. It was things over the years. It's been businesses and companies such as the fixed line telephone operator, Telecom Malaysia, where the
Mhm.
government has a golden share and is major shareholder. Publicly traded. Telecom Malaysia, some of the toll roads, the postal system, Proton, the car manufacturer, the electric utility. These are just some of the businesses that the government had a major stake in, a major role in. And so some of the assets at the outset of Khazanah were put into Khazanah. And Khazanah had major stakes in some of these various businesses and over the years as well. So it's important to note that there was no major cash infusion from
Mhm.
the government. And the initial focus was to manage those assets more efficiently and create value through them. But I should stress that it was never about creating value at the expense of social equality, inclusiveness, sustainability. And so it was balancing these. And over time, there was an improvement in governance and quote unquote creating value. And so shares were either sold or taken public. And so over time, Khazanah created its own capital
Mhm.
base, meaningful capital base. And then from there, they could start making investments. It's important to note that over the life of Khazanah, some of the key milestones, one was what is known as the government GLC transformation.
Mhm.
And that involved, as the name implies, transformation of some of these
So,
key government linked companies. And there were regular forums. There are books, reference guides that Khazanah has put together, and a lot of these things happened under a wonderful MD, fellow by the name of Tansri Asman Mokhtar, who I am personally extremely grateful to have involved me in that organization. So that was sort of
the history of it.
a bit of it. And then over time, there were offices that have been opened overseas, in London, in Istanbul, in the US, in Beijing, just to name a few. And those were not meant to be just far-flung empires to make investments. But again, at the heart of it was to make investments that somehow are relevant to Malaysia and the Malaysian people. And that for me was the most refreshing.
Mm.
I'll share with you a little bit of an anecdote. When I first moved to Malaysia in 2011, I would arrive sometimes from traveling at immigration, and I would get a skeptical, very skeptical glance, from the immigration officer, and looking at my passport, looking at me, and on my visa it says, well, that Ken Shen is employed at Khazanah, and they would look at me, and I was very skeptical because in those days Khazanah didn't necessarily have a good reputation. And often, and as I do a lot, I was happy to talk to them, and because ultimately I was an employee of the people.
Mm.
And in those days, there was a lot of skepticism, a lack, I call it a lack of understanding of what Khazanah really did. But what was extremely refreshing to me that over the years, as I went through the immigration and as I talked to the immigration officials, many of them would say, "Oh, Khazanah,
Thumbs up.
great, bole, bole," and that was very refreshing to me to see that we were doing things that were good, relevant, and people recognize that.
So it was
Uh,
not only an investment transformation, but also a people transformation
Reputation,
in term
yes,
recognition of it.
reputation. And over time, Kazana has, in my mind, become a partner of choice for many investors, whether they be domestic or international, people who are looking to make a significant investment in the country. And I often, when I get calls from business associates, friends, classmates, people I've come in contact with over the years, people who are looking at making a commitment to Malaysia, I one of the first things that comes to mind, of course, depending on the situation, I ask them, well, have you thought about Khazanah?
Mm.
Another good example is the restructuring of Malaysia Airlines,
Yes.
which was um, faced a number of challenges. The two unfortunate aircraft incidents, financial challenges over the years, and there is no better organization than Khazanah to take that over. This is aside. It's not for me as a non-Malaysian to comment on whether or not there should be a national flag carrier. That's a decision for the people, for the government, and all the relevant parties. But if the decision is made to to say, okay, we need a national flag carrier, then in my opinion, there's no better organization than a Khazanah to help, work with the regulators, to help create the regulatory framework, to do the hard work in terms of the restructuring and think through a number of the challenges, and then ultimately perhaps bring in outside investors.
Yeah.
And the work, it's still work in progress. There are an awful lot of challenges, but that's the type of organization that made the most sense in
Yeah.
in that particular situation.
When Sri Lankans think of Malaysia, we also think of Malaysia as a tourism destination, and one of the key attractions is Legoland. And I think during your time, that was an investment you were able to attract, plus the Pinewood studios as well. Talk us through how that happened. What was some of the key things that enabled Malaysia to be able to attract these institutions?
So for the Legoland, there was a lot of work. Khazanah owns about 10,000 acres in Johor, which is just north of Singapore. So there was an awful lot of work, and much of it predates my involvement with the
Right.
organization. But there was a lot of thought put into, well, what are we going to do with this
Plot of
property?
land.
And some of it was development, earmarked for development for communities. Some of it was commercial, but a significant part of it was for this theme park. And much of the capital came from Khazanah, which is sort of the part of the mandate for an organization and role for an organization like that to catalyze, to take the lead. And so Khazanah made the commitment, found the partners, um, the Legoland, the organization that controlled the Legoland IP in the UK, a group called Merlin, and reached an agreement where a large part of the capital would be provided and by us, and they provided IP. And ultimately, what happened was that the Legoland became the first Legoland park in Asia,
Yeah.
um, and provided a significant boost to inbound tourism, uh, especially people coming across the border from Singapore. But of course, there are pluses and minuses to being located there. And what I do regret is that we weren't able to capture a lot more of the wallet for longer stay, because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people would come across for a day, make it a short trip.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what I wanted to do, um, as part of my responsibilities for the leisure and tourism sector, was to create longer term, higher spending stay in Malaysia, as well as developing the human capital. Because, like Sri Lanka, Malaysia has wonderful natural beauty and
Yes.
wonderful tourist attractions. The other important achievement was involving a property called the Datai in Langkawi. And that property had been founded in the 90s by private sector entrepreneurs
Right.
as a wonderful property in the rainforest, really special, really unique. I had the privilege of going with my family years earlier, probably about 97, 98, when I first moved to Hong Kong. And we always remember being there. And then to my surprise and to my great delight, that was part of my portfolio. And what had happened was the entrepreneurs were looking to exit that
Oh.
property. And a decision was made, and this was before I joined Khazanah, to not allow that property to be sold into another set of private hands, but for Khazanah to take it and use that as a toehold to help build, again, longer stay, higher spending tourism into Malaysia, and to help develop that sector further and develop human capital. We spent a lot of money renovating that property, and a few years ago, Time magazine honored that property as being one of the leading resorts
Wow.
in the world. You asked about the Pinewood
Yes.
Studios.
Yeah.
So the thinking there was, the Malaysians have wonderful artistic and creative talent. And so there was a lot of thought as to, well, how do we tap into that and how do we move further up the value chain from basic primary industries, but move into things where there's a much higher value add to the country and to the economies. And then also tap into that creative talent. Now, the film production business has a huge multiplier effect for countries where film production work is done. And so we realized that, and we said, okay, how do we tap into that? So Khazanah again took a catalytic role, made a significant investment to create a world-class production studio, again in Johor, where these 10,000 acres were. And we partnered with one of the leading production studios in the world, Pinewood, UK.
Yeah.
They provided their name and some of the IP, and again, we provided the catalytic funding. One of the challenges was, and so we tapped into that talent and started to create an industry and an ecosystem. One of the challenges is that the film production business, you'll be aware, Sharon, around the world. If you choose to do, say, the Hobbit productions in New Zealand or something in Australia or in Hungary or Canada, a very significant portion of that decision, part of that decision, is the incentive rebate program.
Right.
So you, big producer Sharon, you're looking to do a production, and you'll talk to each of these places, and you'll see, well, how much of a rebate can I get for my spend? And you submit a budget, a plan, and then that gets approved by whatever the regulatory body in the
Right.
respective country. And those rebates are very significant, and often that becomes a decision
To
as to why
show
you're
where.
there and why you're not somewhere else. So we had to work with the government and the regulators to create that framework because it didn't exist.
Right.
And again, it's part of the role for a Khazanah to catalyze and take the lead and perhaps help to create regulations where there aren't, similar to what Khazanah did with the restructuring of Malaysia Airlines, because a lot of these frameworks don't exist.
Hmm.
And so it is rolling up sleeves, sitting side by side with the relevant parties and doing that work. Um, you can imagine it was a little bit challenging for me, not being a local Malaysian as well, uh, to gain
Get that.
the credibility on
Sure.
the opposite side of the table
Sure.
with a lot of these parties.
And finally, Ken, I think in terms of some of the lessons that you can learn from Khazanah and the Malaysian model to maybe Sri Lanka's own state-owned enterprise reform and how to go about it as government has plans to set up a holding company and even model it after Khazanah. What would your advice be? Maybe your top two, three advice be to policymakers?
I think it's important as you have a tremendous number of natural strengths. So look at the hand that you're dealt, look at the cards you have, and figure out where do you have strengths, where are there challenges,
Hmm.
what do you want to be, what do you want to target over the long term, and lay out that map. And importantly, you have to be flexible
Hmm.
because as you're trying to get from A to B, things always will be changing. And you can't have your head down necessarily and say, we're going to B when
Hmm.
B has moved. So it's important to have
Be
those
agile.
objectives
Yeah.
and be agile and be flexible. The great news is you have really capable human capital and experience with experience from around the world. Regulators, your central bank, your finance ministry, people in the government, all the relevant parties are extremely capable. And so, with that framework, I think that's the first step. It's not necessarily about, people will say, well, a sovereign investment organization, we need a huge amount of capital.
Hmm.
That's not necessarily the most important thing. I talked about how Khazanah started. So there are a very significant number of assets that could make sense here in this country um, to initially seed a sovereign investment organization. And then I think it's very important to make sure good governance is in place with solid private sector, domestic, and perhaps even international participation
Right.
from people who are credible, are respected, have a track record, so that you provide that outward facing um, framework
Right.
to parties. Um, and then, as I said, there's a wonderful story here.
Hmm.
You have a wonderful, so whether it's tourism, whether it's some of the various other state-owned enterprises which perhaps have underperformed. And again, I'm not necessarily talking about, well, you become a profit maximizing organization at the expense of inclusivity,
Hmm.
sustainability, creating a
Hmm.
wider gap between the 1% and the others in the country and the others in this country. It's not mutually exclusive, and I think Khazanah has done quite a good job of trying to manage growth with compassion, with justice, with inclusivity and sustainability very much in mind.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ken. I think it was an enlightening conversation on your personal journey, how you ended up finally in Malaysia, and of course the Khazanah journey, how Pinewood and so many other catalytical investments came because of the investments done, and the final advice to Sri Lanka. And I think the biggest strength is the people, as you said, and I think that's what we have to leverage. So to our viewers, stay tuned for insightful discussions like this on our front row series.
Thank
Thank
you very much for having me today, and
thank you.
it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here in Colombo today.